Today in this video we'll be discussing about the fate of fats and proteins as respiratory substrates. Now we have studied that the carbohydrates are the main respiratory substrates which get converted into glucose, and then this glucose undergoes the process of glycolysis to form pyruvic acid. This pyruvic acid then gets converted by a gateway step into acetyl coenzyme A, and then it enters into the Krebs cycle. So this is the process which we have studied, explaining about the fate of carbohydrates. But apart from carbohydrates, or although we can consider the glucose as the main substrate for respiration, because the carbohydrate directly doesn't enter into the Krebs cycle, it gets converted into glucose, broken down simpler sugars, that is glucose, and then further it will break down and enter finally as acetyl coenzyme A into the Krebs cycle. Now, there are other respiratory substrates other than carbohydrates, that is fats and proteins. So they can also be respired unlike carbohydrates, but they do not enter the respiratory pathway at the first step. So they do not directly enter into the respiratory pathway, that is the Krebs cycle. Now let us talk about the respiratory substrates. Over here, carbohydrate will be the main substrate, whereas fats and proteins are the other respiratory substrates. Never a pure proteins or fats are respiratory substrate. It is a combination of all. So let us discuss about the breakdown, or how do fats and proteins are utilized as respiratory substrates. Now fats will first undergo the process of hydrolysis. So over here the fats will undergo a process which is known as hydrolysis and will form fatty acids and glycerol. Fats after hydrolysis will form fatty acids and glycerol. Now these the fatty acid will undergo beta oxidation to form acetyl coenzyme A. The glycerol, although it is a precursor of glucose, that means glycerol is, we can obtain glucose from there, but it is converted into 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde to enter into the Krebs cycle. So this glycerol will get converted into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and will then form the pyruvic acid and acetyl coenzyme A, whereas the fatty acid will directly be converted into acetyl coenzyme A after beta oxidation and will be ready to enter into the Krebs cycle. We know the fate of the carbohydrates. Let us talk about the proteins. Now, proteins are also hydrolyzed, or they will also undergo the process of hydrolysis with the help of enzyme proteases. So, here the amino acids, if we talk, amino acids will get converted, the proteins will be converted into amino acids by the process of hydrolysis, and enzyme used here is proteases. Now, as the proteins will be broken down into their constituent amino acids, after a series of reaction, that is the enzyme proteases will help in deamination, that is the removal of the amino group, and will enter into the Krebs cycle as pyruvic acid. So here we see that directly fats and proteins are not entering into the Krebs cycle. Fatty acids, if they are respired by the body, then what happens? There is actually the acetyl, if like the fatty acids first broke down into fatty acids get converted into acetyl coenzyme A, but in certain circumstances, this fatty acid may be required by the body. Now, when fatty acids are required by the body, the acetyl coenzyme A is stopped from being or from entering into the Krebs cycle. Let us understand this once again. The fats, the carbohydrates, and the proteins are the respiratory substrates. Now, these respiratory substrates, out of which the carbohydrate is the main substrate, and by a series of reactions, it will enter into the Krebs cycle to produce the energy. This we have studied. Now, fats and proteins are other, you can say, accessory respiratory substrate, because the respiratory substrates are not purely carbohydrates or purely proteins or fats. It's a combination of all. So, when we see the breakdown of fats, fats will undergo hydrolysis to produce the fatty acids and the glycerol. The fatty acids get converted into acetyl coenzyme A by direct beta oxidation, whereas the glycerol will form dihydroxycetone phosphate or glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, that is PGAL, and will form the pyruvic acid and finally the acetyl coenzyme A to enter into Krebs cycle. The proteins. The proteins forms the amino acid by the hydrolysis, and in presence of enzyme proteases, the proteases actually removes the amino group afterwards to form the pyruvic acid and the acetyl coenzyme A to enter again into the Krebs cycle. But certain times the body requires the fatty acid for other processes or metabolic activities. During that time, the fatty acid conversion to acetyl coenzyme A, but this acetyl coenzyme A does not enter into the Krebs cycle and the fatty acids are restored. So here, fatty acids are synthesized. So the respiratory pathway can help in breakdown of fatty acids or its synthesis. It is performing both over here. First is breakdown of fatty acids to form the acetyl coenzyme A. But when it is required, the acetyl coenzyme is stopped from entering into the Krebs cycle and it produces or it synthesizes the fatty acids. So respiratory pathway is actually supporting the breakdown of the fats or the synthesis of the fatty acids. Since it is having both, therefore respiratory pathway is also known as amphibolic pathway. Amphi means dual purpose. It is having both. That is breakdown process, because it is also respiratory pathway is a catabolic process. We call the catabolic processes as the processes which helps to break down the complex material into simpler forms or breakdown of the complex compounds. So here the fatty acids are converted into simpler forms, that is the catabolic process. But here again, if it is in condition in certain circumstances, acetyl coenzyme A produces fatty acids. So here the synthesis or the anabolism has taken place, or anabolic process. Since catabolic process and anabolic process both are taking place in respiratory pathway, it is also referred to as amphibolic pathway. Also, this reaction is important. These amphibolic, it is important because it shows the interrelationship between the metabolic pathways. All the metabolic pathways, whether it is catabolism or anabolism, lead to the formation of acetyl coenzyme A, and this will enter into the Krebs cycle. So this amphibolic pathway also explains about, or the respiratory pathway also explains about the interrelationship between metabolic pathways.